Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Today, we're talking about the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, known by the catchy moniker of CBAM. Ever since 2023, when the EU announced it would be introducing a CBAM, businesses and traders have been looking for answers on how it impacts their supply chains. The UK government has said it will be introducing its own version, while other nations like Canada and the US have also expressed an interest. With the EU CBAM, both importers and exporters need to be aware of the rules of CBAM. This session is an introduction to some of the incoming changes with an all-star cast of panel to discuss and answer some of your questions. However, if you want to learn more, our member exclusive lunchtime learning series on the 24th of July will be going into more detail on the UK CBAM specifically. Also, Joe, who you'll hear from shortly, runs a CBAM compliance half-day training course, which contains all you need to investigate the regulatory requirements and develop a CBAM strategy. On the next page, you'll be able to scan the QR code or follow the link in our chats to book the 30th of July or 24th of September date. However, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Joe. Joe is our in-house SPS expert, as well as one of the Chartered Institute's foremost advisors on customs and trade. Joe, how are you today?
Yeah, keeping well, thanks, Phil. Yeah, looking forward to today's webinar to touch on the rather complex sometimes, but interesting world of CBAM.
Thanks, Joe. And on the next slide, you'll see the rest of the panel who will be answering your questions, including myself and the senior editor at the Chartered Institute. But we have Fergus McReynolds, who's our EU and International Director, Kate Foster from the Federation of Small Business, and Paul Brooks, our manufacturing lead. How are we all today?
Very well, thank you.
Very well, thanks.
Yeah, good, Phil, thanks.
No problem. Thank you very much, and we look forward to hearing from you shortly. However, on the next slide, we have we have a bit more on our CBAM program. Again, you'll see some links popping up in the chat if you're interested in booking the course. On the next slide, we will launch the first of our polls to sort of gauge a bit more about you and what you know about the topic. So how much preparation have you done on CBAM? A lot, some, not much, or non-applicable. And just while that runs, I'd like to remind you of our normal housekeeping notes on CBAM. So we will be answering some of your questions, and we look forward to that. But if you can keep them as generic and brief as possible, it does help us answer as many as possible. Also, if you could avoid asking questions that are too sector or company specific, it allows us to answer as many questions as possible for as broad an audience as possible. Finally, we will be sharing the slides and a copy of the webinar video. The webinar video will also be hosted on the website. So do keep an eye on that in your inboxes as the day progresses. I can see most of you have voted. I'll give another couple of seconds for everyone to give their feedback. Thank you as always, we do appreciate this. So I'll close the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so everyone, about 9% say they have done a lot of preparation, 38% some preparation, 26% say not much preparation, 17% say no preparation, and 10% it does not apply to them. Joe and the rest of the panel, sort of, is this what you'd expect?
To be quite honest, Phil, yes, I kind of expected this answer. There has been a real wide range of businesses involved in the scope of CBAM, and they affect them in different ways. And some would have the resources to do a lot of preparation for this. Others, they may well have been a bit blindsided by the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So honestly, I think the poll is kind of representative of what it's like in the UK as a whole at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Oh, go on, Paul.
Phil, the only thing I'd add to that is I just wonder with I think it was the 10% or maybe more said it was not applicable, whether in fact it is not applicable to them and whether they may have reassessed things at the end of today's webinar, but we'll see. But like Joe, I think broadly expected those types of numbers.
And so the only thing I would add is that I think it's fair to say that there's been a lot of uncertainty in the market and understanding how CBAM has evolved since the first coming into force of the measure in Europe. It's already changed at least once in terms of the transitional period, the reporting dates, and we've already got at the moment a simplification package which is underway, which is going to change things. So, yeah, I think you do really understand the challenge that businesses face at the moment. That there isn't a overwhelming amount of simple clarity on a lot of this at the moment.
And very much sympathise with the smaller businesses among you who, I mean, Joe's already touched on, the lack of resources to maybe prepare for this, especially if you don't know exactly what you need to do. And it's something that we come up against, not just with CBAM, but with a lot of big policy changes, that it's very, very difficult to plan ahead when you don't have the cash flow, the resources, the in-house expertise to do so.
Thank you, everyone. Firstly, for sharing your insights on that, and thank you, everyone who voted. You'll hear from the rest of the panel shortly, but for the moment, I'm going to hand over to Joe. Over to you, Joe.
Thank you, Phil. So today we'll be talking about CBAM, and many of attendees on today's call will likely have heard of the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or just the acronym CBAM. But it's better to understand the policy and what it means for businesses. So it's important to understand how the policy came to be. Next slide, please. So what is the EU CBAM? Well, before CBAM came to play, there was a different scheme in place, and it still is in place for other industries, known as the Emissions Trading Scheme, or ETS. The EU ETS was established in 2005 and encouraged a reduction in emissions from carbon-intensive industries. These industries would have CO2 emissions and document those in an annual report, and then surrender any allowances which would have been purchased. Now, in a review of the ETS as part of a wider policy called the EU Green Deal, it highlighted that whilst the scheme had seen a reduction in emissions, carbon leakage had occurred. Now, carbon leakage is a concept which means that many companies had been basically offshoring their production away from the EU. And it was going to third countries which didn't have any real stringent climate policies, meaning that they could emit more CO2 with little consequence, so long as they moved their production away from the EU. So a new policy was introduced in 2023, which is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. And this was to enhance the stringent part of the Green Deal, but also to make sure that it was countering this carbon leakage. It required importers to report on imported products from 6 sectors. This is iron and steel, aluminium, cement, fertilizers, hydrogen, and electricity. But in order to do the report, they need feedback from exporters. So what do you need as an exporter to fulfill your obligations? Next slide, please. Well, first, exporters need to check whether any of the commodities they export are covered by the scope of the CBAM. So exporters really need to double check their classification of goods. Sometimes they do get caught out where there might be a good or two, such as screws, for example, which are within the scope of iron and steel, and they will fall under that list of commodities, meaning that they're within the scope of the CBAM. Now, importers in the EU rely on the data from exporters on the embedded emissions of their goods. So they will need to feed back information so that that importer based in the EU can fulfill their reporting obligations. Now, in order to do that, they would need direct emission data. Well, what is that? That relates to the emissions which have occurred on site at production. Now, this could be fuels consumed during production, as well as any CO2 which has been emitted during production, such as certain gases or other processing. Then you have indirect emissions data. Now, indirect emissions relate to the electricity used during the production of goods. And then finally, information on precursors used. So that's emission data needed on any material used during the production, which are also in scope. So if you're producing some parts of, say, aluminium, it may be that you're forming an aluminium part for automotive, and you've just got a block of aluminium. You would need the data for what carbon content was in that block. Now, this requires transparency in the supply chain, as much of this data might not have been held by exporters before. Furthermore, even if the exporter is not the manufacturer of the goods, they would still need to obtain that data relevant to the products they dispatch to the EU, because otherwise the EU importer doesn't have that data to hand. Next slide, please. Once the importer has obtained all of the relevant data on the embedded emissions of the product they are importing into the EU, the next step is to file a quarterly report detailing the commodities within the scope of the CBAM brought into the European Union. The emissions data, coupled with the weight of goods brought into the Union, will give a final figure of CO2 which has been technically imported into the Union. Now, from 2026, the fiscal stage of the CBAM goes live. We're currently in what is known as the transitional phase. Once the fiscal phase goes live, it means that importers will need to purchase CBAM certificates. These certificates will mirror ETS prices, and once purchased, they will be surrendered dependent on how many metric tons of CO2 have been imported into the country. Next slide, please. But this is the state of play how it is at the moment. And as I'm sure many of you on the call will be aware, there are some upcoming changes. Now, the omnibus package was announced on the 26th of February 2025, so earlier this year, with sweeping reforms on the CBAM policy, it's fair to say, which caught the attention of businesses both in the EU and further afield. Expected to come into the regulation from September, one of the most notable reforms is the introduction of a new de minimis or threshold at which CBAM reporting needs to be done. The current rule, so the one currently in play at the moment, is that there is a fiscal limit of €150 per consignment. So anything more than that, you have to file a CBAM report and obtain that data. But with the omnibus proposal, this would now change to a weight limit of 50 metric tons of CBAM goods imported per annum. Now, whilst that seems like a lot, there are still some industries which are intensive in terms of weight. So do not rest on your laurels, because there very much is a chance that the importer you deal with could still fall within the scope of CBAM reporting. Another major change is the proposed introduction of a new default data set. There is currently some default data. However, you're not allowed to use this. So in current CBAM policy, you must try and obtain true factual data on the direct and indirect emissions. Now, this new default data set will replace the previously published guidance, but will allow this data to be used instead of accurately worked out data emissions for the first time. Both importers and exporters will still need to be vigilant, however, as reporting obligations still need to be undertaken. exporters will still be encouraged to try and provide accurate data where possible, as this is likely to lead to quite a lot lower embedded carbon emission figures, meaning that less CBAM certificates will be surrendered. So that's a very quick overlook into the state of play at the minute. And if we want to go to the next slide. And Phil, if you want to jump in.
No worries. Thank you, Joe, for that introduction. So if you want to learn more, Joe's CBAM training course is where he goes into detail on a lot of the topics he mentioned, including how to keep compliant. He covers things like how to get data for CBAM, when to use this when submitting reports, and some of the wider strategies you can use. You also get to ask him further questions, and you also get a digital certificate proving your CBAM prowess for everyone to see. We'll also be moving on to some of your questions shortly, but just before that, on the next slide, you'll see we're launching our second poll. How aware are you of the EU's CBAM simplification? Very aware, somewhat aware, unaware, very unaware. So I'll just launch that now. Just as a quick reminder, we will be dropping in some of the links for the 30th of July or the 24th of September in the chat. Please do keep an eye out there. Also, if you want to attend the next Lunchtime Learning, which is exclusive for members, the link is also in the chat. It goes a bit more in depth on some of the topics mentioned here and is focused on the UK CBAM. We will also be answering some more questions on the UK version specifically. I know there's a lot to get through today. And another reminder on some of the questions you dropped in. I've seen a few of them. So as another reminder, the slides and the presentation, and the video will be sent on in the follow-up. So do keep the rest of those questions coming. So I'm going to close the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so interestingly, about 60% say they're either very or somewhat aware, with 12% saying very and 48% saying somewhat. Only 30% said unaware, and 10% said they had no clue about it. So, Joe and the rest of the panel, what do you think about this? Is this sort of what you expect?
Yeah, I think this is to be expected, to be honest. I would say I'm quite surprised by the 12% who are very aware, because the omnibus package is a statement of intent. It's not a full regulation, so we don't know the full ins and outs of it yet. We know what has been suggested and what we expect to come into play in September. However, that has not been formally made a regulation yet. So I would expect some people to be aware, maybe a bit too optimistic, or trying to hedge their bets that they won't have to do anything yet. But for some people, yeah, it has passed them by.
And discuss the results. Does anyone else want to come in before we go to the Q&A?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Phil, as I said earlier, I think it does show a reflection that there is quite a lot of change happening in this policy area at the moment. I mean, I'm encouraged by the figures that 60% of people are aware, or at least very aware, or at least aware, which I think is positive in understanding that there is good market awareness that there are changes. But I think it's understandable for those who haven't been aware. This is a very rapidly evolving area of policy at the moment.
Thank you very much. And on that, on the next slide, you'll see we are at the first part of the panel session. So the first question we've got is, we've seen a lot of change to the EU-UK CBAM. How are we sure this is this current version will be the final one? Joe, I'm going to pitch that to you first. So how do you know this version of CBAM is the last one?
Well, you can almost be certain that it won't be the last one to some degree. The fact is, we do have further regulation coming in as part of the omnibus package later this year. And as I'm sure some of the other panelists will allude to, there is also the chance that there will be more products which will come into the scope of CBAM. A consultation was opened quite recently, and it could well be that other products downstream from these sectors could be included in the scope of CBAM to coming into the future.
Yeah, I think I would add to that, Phil, that I think one other uncertainty at the moment is the announcement which came out between the UK and the EU during the summit in May, which is exploring the linkage of the emissions trading schemes between the two parties, and that will have a ramification for CBAM, certainly for UK exporters. That could potentially see an alignment of the approaches in the UK and in the EU, and potentially some easement for exporters from the UK into the EU market, where essentially a equivalent carbon price and carbon scheme is in place. So I think there are still some changes to come. I think, as Joe has rightly said, we've still got the development of the UK policy in this area. We have different timelines for the UK policy and the EU policy. The simplification package is being concluded, and the actual regulation itself hasn't formally been laid. So we still need to see that and when that comes into force. And as I said, that final element of potential changes, whether the UK and the EU do achieve over, as it stands, a relatively unknown time period, linkage between the emissions trading schemes, which could alleviate that. I think the one thing and the one message I'd like to certainly leave people with is there are a set of obligations today, and I think it's important that you understand what those are, and that you are compliant and working with your European customers to understand how you are compliant with today's rules, because it isn't certain how this will evolve into the future. Compliance today is important, whether there are changes in the future or not.
Thank you, Fergus. Anyone else got anything to add on that question?
I think the word is fluid in international trade at the moment, Phil, and I think we have, the people on this call, the businesses that are preparing for this have to be aware that there will be changes. We know what we know at this current time, but we need to prepare for all eventualities. I am encouraged, though, by the general awareness that we've seen from the two polls that you've produced so far. In that, I was talking to quite a large logistics firm that we work closely with just yesterday, and they were talking about more widely across Europe the fact that they were a little concerned that there was a lack of understanding of EU CBAM regulations, etc., as they currently stand. So I'm encouraged by today, but I don't think we can rest on our laurels. We need to prepare on the basis of what the facts that are known today, but accepting that, as Joe and Ferguson mentioned, they're probably going to change before we get to full implementation, and they're going to develop over time as well once they are implemented. So that's the reality of the world that we operate in now. We have to react and be flexible and fluid.
Thank you, Paul. So just got another question in. This one's a bit of a tricky one. I'll pitch this to Joe first. What are the known unknowns? So what don't we know about CBAM that we should know?
Sorry, I was on mute there. I mean, there are still quite a few unknowns, to be honest. I think it's fair to say that some companies, both in the EU as well as the UK, are hedging their bets on the omnibus package because they have struggled to obtain data. But we don't know what this new default data set is going to look like. So for some of the larger importers in the EU, they're not going to be too happy overpaying and surrendering too many CBAM certificates. So that's one big unknown, is we don't know what this new default data set will look like and whether this is going to be beneficial for UK exporters or for EU importers. And furthermore, with the consultation, what are these downstream products going to look like? Is it going to affect certain industries such as automotive or aerospace, for example? And then there are other carbon intensive sectors as well. So there is a real chance that other big sectors could come under the scope of CBAM going forward.
Thank you, Joe. Fergus, do you have anything to add to that one?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I think one of the things which is unclear at this stage is the agreement in principle for the UK and the EU to work on linking their emissions trading schemes and the impact that that's going to have on the carbon border adjustment mechanisms. I think as those two are developing in parallel, the UK system and the EU system, it isn't clear at this stage what the timeline for that would be. I would anticipate that it's not something which will be delivered in the next 12 months. So I think, as I said before, the important thing is to understand where the regulations are today, what your obligations are as an exporter working with your European importer, certainly in the first instances on the EU scheme, and understand that this is going to be an evolving policy landscape in the next 3 or 4 years.
Thinking about from the small business perspective as well, we know from speaking to our members, and this is not specifically in relation to CBAM, but in relation to sustainability reporting generally, that there is a risk that with growing requirements, small businesses are being asked to supply lots of different data sets and lots of different formats and different levels, depending on who's asking them. And I think there's a lot of concern and unknowns among FSB members, certainly about exactly how they are going to be expected to deliver that data.
Thank you, Kate. Actually, we've got a good question I think we can ask you on this one. So someone said, we don't import cement, aluminium, or any of those other mentioned products. How worried should we be?
Well, there's a short answer and a long answer, and the short answer is it depends. So Joe and the others have already touched on the fact that there is a lot that we still don't know about what the final shape of CBAM is going to be. It's not fully realised. There are still possible expansions in the scope to new products. We don't know the timelines. So in the first instance, even if you're not currently in scope directly now, you might be in the future. So it's definitely not time to take your eye off the ball. And then secondly, depending on where you are in the supply chain, whether you're an importer, an exporter, a manufacturer, even if you don't export directly to the EU yourself, the businesses that you work with might be required to report if they are not below the threshold. So you need to make sure that the businesses that you work with know their obligations. You also need to understand how to calculate your own embedded emissions, your carbon content, and it is the importer's responsibility, but it's also incumbent on you to be able to provide that information. That's something, again, from the small business perspective, that we would like to see a more holistic approach to, making sure that small businesses are ready for this. Our data shows that, again, not on CBAM specifically, but around reporting on sustainability, over half of small businesses that were asked to report on their emissions data were asked by the businesses that they work with. So it's very much something that businesses need to be on top of. Even if you're not directly in scope, you need to be aware of what's happening.
Thank you, Kate. Joe, do you have anything to add to that one?
Yeah, I think that's a great reply, to be honest. And the fact is that, especially with small businesses, they might not have the resources to fully classify or check the classification of all of their goods. So some of them may well have been misclassified. And that in turn can lead to extra CBAM reporting down the line, or they get blindsided by request for CBAM data when they didn't expect it, because stuff like screws and like bolts and such, they do fall under the scope of CBAM, and not every business is aware of this. So I think even if you don't assume that the products you export are within the immediate scope, double check, because actually often there is the odd niggly 1 or 2 SKUs which might well be in scope.
Thank you, Joe. And this one is more specific to Fergus. We obviously covered the difference between the UK and the EU one. So Fergus, we've seen the EU shift their approach on regulations recently. How has the attitude of Brussels towards environmental regulation shifted recently, and is this likely to continue?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, Phil. I think we are in the first year of the second term of Commission President von der Leyen. This is her second Commission, but I think it's very fair to say that it's a very different makeup of the Commission than it is for the last 5 years. There was a huge appetite to bring forward green policies under the previous mandate over the last 5 years. And in fact, many policies were accelerated in the last year or so of that mandate. And what we're seeing is actually there's a shift in the politics in Europe. There is a growing sense, particularly from the centre right of European politics, who now find themselves in a controlling position in the European Parliament and around the European Council, that the burden on businesses needs to be balanced against the ambition on green policies. I think the Commission and the European Union as a general would defend the fact that this isn't about watering down their environmental obligations or their environmental ambitions, but it is just about making it more business friendly. So I think that we are likely to see reviews, reductions in burden. The changes to the CBAM are part of a wider move to look at simplification across a number of supply chain and trade related policies, not least the due diligence in supply chains, questions around deforestation regulations and forced labour. There was a lot of policy which was driving different behaviours in international supply chains, and I think that there's a recognition that there is a huge burden on businesses in order to continue trading, and I think that there is a political appetite in Europe under this next 5 years to try and find the right balance between that green and environmental ambition, but actually making it work for businesses as well.
Thank you, Fergus. So I'm just going to let the panelists take a quick break while they grab some water, and I'm going to, on the next slide, ask the next of our, or the final of our polls. So, are you engaging with your EU importer on CBAM? Yes, a lot. Yes, some. No, or NA. While I do that, we've had a few questions via email and a few more through the chat. Just a reminder, if you could keep them as brief and general as possible. We've got a few that are very interesting but are very specific and quite wordy, so it's very difficult for me to ask them to the experts. I'll of course do my best, but if any last questions that come through could be a bit concise, that does help me massively with asking these questions to the experts. And as another reminder, we will be sending the slides and the recording along shortly after the webinar ends, so do keep an eye on your inboxes. We've got about another 10 minutes after the webinar, so we'll be able to get to most of your questions. I'm just going to let the poll run for another few seconds. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so possibly an interesting answer here. 8% said a lot. Sorry, they're engaging a lot with it on CBAM. 33% saying they are engaging somewhat on CBAM. 37% say they're engaged the EU importer. They're not engaged the EU importer, and 22% say NA. Before I get back to the question, does anyone have any comment on this poll result? And is this, if so, is this about what we'd expect at this stage?
I would say I'm quite surprised by the amount which have said no for CBAM, for engaging with EU importers on CBAM. I thought it would have been higher, a tip towards yes a lot or yes some, and I'm surprised that so many have said no. I don't know what you think, Fergus.
Yeah, no, Joe, I share that observation. I think one of the challenges with a policy such as CBAM is that the obvious legal requirement sits with the EU importer. Ultimately, that is where the regulation bites. That's the legal obligation sits with. But inevitably, as we all know in international trade, these things become somewhat of a condition of supply. So while the obligation sits with the EU importer, what you may well find is actually they make this contractual arrangement for you to supply. If you want to continue to supply, you need to also supply this data along with it. So I would share the concern that if you're not engaging with your EU importer on this, that perhaps a few questions to them to ask them, are they aware of their obligations, and knowing that the result of the answer to that question may mean that there's a requirement for you to supply them with further information. I think that's really key here, is that ultimately these sorts of policies become embedded into supply chains, and the condition of supply is supplying this information.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to hide the poll results now. Okay, there does appear to be a bit of a glitch with the current with the screen sharing system. I think we'll try and get that sorted in the background. But we have a question in on email from Dorata. We are a distributor of goods not involved in manufacturing processes, nor do we have access to data for the manufacturing process. Can we be exempt from the CBAM submission? And if not, how do we calculate this? Who wants to take this one first?
I'm happy to. Unfortunately, the answer is no, you are not exempt. Even though you are not the manufacturer of the goods, you are still supplying CBAM goods, which are going into the European Union. So you need to obtain data from the manufacturers on what direct emissions, indirect emissions have occurred during the manufacturing process for those goods. And then those need to go onwards to your importer in the EU. Now, this could change as part of the omnibus package, where you might be able to use a default data set going forwards. But as we alluded to, we expect this to be significantly higher than if you had worked out the embedded emissions. And I guess part of the CBAM policy is about more of a transparent supply chain. So as part of this, you'd be better placed going back to those manufacturers to try and obtain data, because it's going to work more in your favor.
I think the only thing that I would add to that, I think, is recognizing that as it stands at the moment, CBAM is primarily a reporting requirement. So it's about reporting the embedded carbon. But in the future, this will become a fiscal requirement. There will be an associated cost with the level of carbon. So it is in your interest and the interest of the European importer to have real market data so that you can really understand the true cost of that. As it stands at the moment, as I said, a reporting requirement is slightly different. But going forward, that impact on your cost as a supplier into the EU market will become something which I think EU importers see as a competitive issue.
Thank you, Fergus. So we have quite a few questions pouring in. This one's an interesting one from Justin. What do the panel think the unintended consequences of both the UK and EU CBAMs could be? So the unintended consequences. Would anyone like to shine a light on that one?
Yeah, I'm happy. Go on, Kate.
Just playing my small business card. I mean, my concern about all of these requirements is the impact that it might have on small businesses. We've touched already on the lack of resources, maybe the in-house lack of expertise to be able to do this. And my concern is that small businesses might end up being squeezed out of supply chains because of the difficulty of complying, and none of us want to see that.
Yeah, I mean, I would only augment that point that Kate makes, and I think it's true of exporters in the UK and those around the world. I think the other unintended consequence is the political pressure which is being brought to bear on this. I mean, it's quite clear that the current US administration sees CBAM as a significant challenge, and part of conversations about the EU-US trade relationship going forward will ultimately involve conversations around US companies' exposure to CBAM. So I think that there are other consequences here, not just in terms of suppliers. There is a political context, and in a very volatile geopolitical environment, it's certainly the EU is getting a lot of pressure on the impact of CBAM on businesses.
Thank you. So we've only got a few more minutes left, so I'll try and get through as many of your questions as we can. If not, please do get in touch and we'll see if we can answer them or forward you on to the right person. There is a really good one I'm just going to go to. What do you recommend that we do when we can't obtain emission data from our suppliers on the precursors?
This is one of the big current challenges to CBAM, is that certain precursors, especially from certain countries, have been somewhat reluctant to give any type of data, indirect or direct emissions, and that ultimately makes it harder for businesses to remain compliant. What I would say is, if you are doing some form of manufacturing process to those precursors, document that. Try and document some level of compliance to show to your EU importers that you are at least making those strident steps to actually give accurate data, because that goes down well in the eyes of customs authorities in the EU, and it does help EU importers fulfill their obligations.
Thank you very much. Karen, I hope that answers your question. Potentially interesting one from Steve. How will the accuracy of the reporting be checked? Does anyone want to come in on that one? Oh, go on, Joe.
I don't mind coming in on that one again, because it's another one of those which has been heavily discussed, is that when the fiscal element of CBAM goes live, so 2026, not too far away now, you are meant to have this data verified to some degree. Now, it will be a third party, usually, of some sort. So there will be an additional reporting element, which is going to be making sure that actually the data you supply, making sure it's accurate, but making sure it's verified as well. So yeah, there is very much that element is a very important factor. And especially with the omnibus package, I think so many people are focusing on that. They've maybe forgotten that there are certain additional parts of the reporting, such as verification, which no one's really looked into yet. So I think that will play a big part coming into next year.
Thank you, Joe. And the last question we've just getting through email, actually, from Tomi. How likely is it that CBAM will be scrapped? Yeah, does anyone want to sort of deal with that one? There are apparently reports, this person says, that it could be. Would anyone like to deal with the possibility of CBAM being scrapped at this stage?
I'm happy to come in on that one, Phil. And all of the indications from a European perspective is that this policy is here to stay. It's part of a wider set of policies from an industrial perspective in Europe. So CBAM also has an impact over the emissions trading scheme and the level of allowances that energy-intensive industries receive. So this policy is embedded in the European ambition for net zero. So my feeling is that while we may well see changes, simplifications, questions over whether the second phase, where it is extended to a wider product range or a wider downstream products, I think that's in question. But as it stands at the moment, I don't think there's any indication that the policy will be scrapped.
Paul, over to you for the final word. Or I think you're on mute.
Apologies. Yep. I think Fergus said it far more eloquently than I could. I guess you can't rule anything out these days, but I think it's unlikely to be scrapped. Maybe a simplified or watered down version at some stage, but I think we should prepare. And the call out to everybody on this call is to prepare from the basis of what we know now, because it will be onerous and it will be important to prepare, and it's not something you can just leave to the last minute and then react to if it does come into force on the dates that are suggested. So preparation would be key, I guess.
And one final thing just to say on that, because I think it also is important to reflect on the UK-EU summit, which did talk directly to linking the emissions trading schemes. If that happens, it does lower the burden on UK exporters into the EU. Whether that will result in the absolute elimination, I think is a question. But it will also be intrinsically linked to the origin of the product itself as well. So whether it's traded from the UK into the EU, if there is a linkage of the emissions trading schemes, doesn't guarantee that product wouldn't be caught under the CBAM, because the ultimate origin of that product may be different. So I think it's fair to say that there is an aspiration between the UK and the EU following the summit to remove some of the burden of CBAM from the UK-EU relationship. But still there will be a lot of devil in the detail as those negotiations and discussions evolve over the coming months.
Thank you very much. Thanks for that question, Tommy. Hope I answered that one. And thanks for everyone else who sent in their questions. Unfortunately, we're out of time. But firstly, thank you for everyone who's sharing the questions. Very much added to the discussion. And thank you to our all-star panel of Joe, Fergus, Paul, and Kate. We appreciate your insight as always. On the next slide, just a final reminder, if you want to develop you or your team's knowledge and be assured of CBAM compliance, Joe is running an in-depth training course where you can gain your CBAM certificate to demonstrate the accuracy and boost your ESG credentials. On the next slide after that, there's the key dates for your diary, so the member exclusive learning, delving into the CBAM specifically, then the 2 upcoming training courses that you can book on by the QR code or follow the link in the chat. I'll leave this screen.
Bill, just jumping in because it's not moving on for me. I'm not sure if everybody else dialed into this webinar. I can see, because I'm still stuck on the "Are you engaging with the EU importer on CBAM" slide. Just to let you know.
Okay, thank you, Paul. There might be a bit of a technical issue with go to webinar, but there will be a link in the chat, and these will be available on the slides and in the follow-up that we'll send on to you. But thank you everyone for attending today. It was a lively discussion as always. Other than wish you a lovely afternoon, please keep an eye out for the post-webinar survey, and yeah, see you next time. Thanks everyone.
Thanks, Phil.
Cheers, Phil.
Thanks everyone.
Cheers.
Bye now.